In a couple of weeks, we are having the EU elections, which means we are voting in our EU Parliament. Our parliamentarians, in turn, will then vote for the head of the Commission. At least this is how it is advertised. They started this, let's say, this promise 5 years ago when they claimed the leader or the front runner of the largest party that makes it into the EU Parliament will also be the head of the Commission. This is because the bureaucracy in Brussels is anonymous or roughly anonymous, impersonal, hardly accountable, and they want to give a face to their product, their ideology. And they are doing this by promising us that we are getting a face that we are voting for. So they make it look like we are having a direct vote, even though we have not. This is reminiscent to how Germany is electing its chancellors. We have no direct vote, yet we expect that the largest party is also then putting forth the nomination for the chancellor, which is always granted. And the last time, Martin Schulz was actually the nomination, and he failed or was stopped by some calls from Angela Merkel, who preferred to see Jean-Claude Juncker. So before the election, we were told the largest party is going to be represented at the head of the Commission. But when that meant a person Angela Merkel did not want in that position, that was changed afterwards. And that was a precursor of the Brexit referendum. People were promised that when they vote out, they go out, and then there are hundreds of excuses and ways around to foil the people's decisions. Now there had been a debate. Only the member of the Conservative Party is not present on stage. But I have looked through at least a portion of the debate, and I will give you a short commentary on that. Enjoy.
For the Party of the European Left is Violeta Tomic. Franz Timmermans is the candidate for the Party of European Socialists. The candidate for the Party of the Greens is Bas Eickhout. Guy Verhofstadt is the candidate for the Alliance of Liberals and Democrats for Europe. The candidate for the European Conservatives and Reformists group is Jan Zahradil.
So the candidates are the Left, the Socialist, the Green, the Liberal, and the Reformist. And there is no real conservative there. The Reformist, to his credit, is a bit more down to earth. He doesn't believe in a truth ministry, for example, and he believes that countries should keep some level of sovereignty within the European Union. On the other side, you have this lady who calls herself the Left. She is more socialist than actually the socialist. Let's now hear the socialist. What he says is not very important, and it is not even grammatically correct. But listen to how the host is actually reacting to it.
You know who did this last night? Pedro Sanchez. And he won the election in Spain. So there is hope for those choices, but the choice is yours. And never be indifferent. Choose.
Perfect.
Now we listen to the conservative. He is at least praising the sovereignty of the nations, but his argument is weird towards a vastly socialist audience. His argument is that the countries are different in the income levels, and therefore this problem of inequality must be resolved by bespoke solutions for bespoke nations.
I have to say that we are still not the same. We are still somehow different, and we have to respect that. Do you know, for instance, what's the average salary here in the Netherlands? It's 2,000 euros. In my country, in the Czech Republic, it's 1,000 euros.
And now we are hearing from the socialist candidate. He is making an opening statement that speaks of all the power creed that you will notice later on again and again, and that you may have heard already when you live in the EU, whether it is the continental part or Great Britain. The argument is that Europe would only succeed in a world of empires like Russia, China, US, India, and so forth, if we stood united under a centralized government in Brussels. Now this is quite crazy, and it is also at its core anti-democratic. What these people do not mention, and probably do not even fully understand, is that America isn't actually, for example, an empire. America is a democracy, or better, a republic, and that means it doesn't have an emperor. You do need an emperor to run an empire. But they believe in these strong, centrally controlled entities, and either you are quick on acting together under the command of one ruler, or you are sort of losing out.
It will be a world of empires, a world of China dominating, India dominating, the US, the Russian Federation.
Good evening, everybody. Nobody can deny that today European Union is quite far away from ideas of democracy, equality and justice. For the bankers and stockbrokers in Frankfurt and City of London, the last economic crisis is just a distant memory. But the politicians in Brussels have time and time again put the interests of banks and corporations in front of interests of the people.
Banks, corporations, capitalists, banks, corporations. You just wait for such a person to call, catch the Jew, catch the Jew, catch the Jew. The opening statement of the lady from the party, the left, shows a lot about the tactic of the communists, since the Frankfurt School have introduced a critical theory. She starts out just throwing accusations against everything first, does not specify much, does not explain, and then tries to just sell her stuff. Here an excerpt from the opening statement of the Green Party politician. He is actually the smartest person on the stage, as you would notice when you see more of the video. But he is also saying very crazy things, and you should take notice of the "but" that he is using in the following statement.
That's exactly the new Europe that we are fighting for. A green and social Europe, so a different Europe. We believe in European cooperation, we believe in strengthening European democracy, but we want to see a socially just and green Europe.
Because the entire event is so long and so dull, I will just analyze one section of it. The first one about the digital age. They started by showing a video presenting supposed problems of the digital developments, like copyright problems, data protection, fake news, and so on. And they give very unspecific questions as next. You will hear the host give you an example here.
So the general question to all of you is, how big do the fines actually need to get? Or what new regulations will you propose to get the tech giants under control? And
so in all seriousness, she's just asking, you know, there's capitalism, big corporations and so on, what are you doing against them? And the conservative, or what they believe is conservative, says, well, we have already some rules and laws and more rules, and we can have more prohibitions, more laws, and forbid more, and that is the way forward.
I believe we have done a lot. We have introduced a lot of legislation. What we have introduced were 30 pieces of legislation concerning digital single market. Some of them very well protecting our privacy, some of them very well designed to protect us against cyber attacks. There are still things to do. For instance, the e-privacy directive is yet to be adopted by the next parliament.
Is this an area where you would actually like to see more regulation? Because what I've learned from your party's position is that you're actually in favor of less regulation. But in this area, you would like to see more.
I believe, as I said, we adopted almost 30 pieces connected with digital single market. Now it's time to implement them. Now it's time for reflection, because individual member states have to implement them, and they must be somehow checked out whether they properly work. If not, they could be improved, they could be changed, but in the European Parliament, on the European level, and when it comes to European Commission, I think we've done a good job.
So here you see that the host is actually pushing her agenda. She is a communist, as you will see when you watch more of the video, and she asked for more of the state, and she's happy that he actually points in that direction and she wants more of it. So she asked, do you want more regulation, more state? And he is open to it and says, well, yes, but we have already made so many laws that are now up for the national parliaments to be implemented. Now I have to explain what that means. In the EU, the laws have to go the following steps. They are initiated by the Commission, and then they run through the Parliament, maybe a little bit refined, but ultimately the proposals of the Commission are put into what they call a directive, that is factually a law, and then the national parliaments have to ratify that. They have to turn them into national laws. Now, this just means that there is a facade now, because the national politicians can say, well, 80% of our laws, this is how much of our legal procedures are actually just implementations of EU directives. 80% of the laws must be done, and you as a people have no say in it anymore, because we have already agreed to it, and there is this higher supposedly democratic body that has made all the decisions, and we now have to follow suit. This goes a step further. If the national parliaments do not actually put through the bills, they still become effective in court. And this has very weird consequences, because the Commission is now no longer refraining itself to proposing prohibitions. They rather set standards as to how the future is supposed to be. And courts can decide whether somebody should be punished for not establishing the situation as it is supposed to be. For example, the emissions of cars are set with there are limits of nitrogen oxygen for diesel cars, and the air on streets is tested for particles of that chemical, and in areas where there are too many molecules per cubic meter or whatever per volume, if there are too many, if the concentration is too high, the cars will ultimately be banned from the streets. We have that situation in the German city of Stuttgart, for example, because the courts will decide that the reality does not yet meet the standards put forth by the EU Commission, which is insane, because a legal process is usually about telling people you shall do this and you should not do that. Instead, the EU is now so far away from any democratic legitimacy that they say the air should be that clean, and when there are some measurements that the air is not clean enough, somebody can be punished by the courts, and this is in this case the city, the town hall of the city of Stuttgart, and the diesel drivers can no longer use the roads. That's how far it goes. And this also shows with the next question. The host is actually asking him whether the tech companies should be fined or regulated. There is not even a sense that first there must be a rule broken, a law broken to fine somebody. The EU has this mentality that, oh, look, there is an American company, let's just grab their money. So he's asking for fines first and then for rules second. And now you hear the socialists say, we just need to forbid a lot of stuff and then magically corporations will be found.
Okay, now we turn to you, Guy Verhofstadt. What would you do on the fines and the regulation?
Well, to start with regulating, because when Mark Zuckerberg came to the European Parliament, the first thing what he said, no, it's not necessary, this regulation. We will manage it ourselves. A few weeks ago, you remember that, Zuckerberg came on television and said, no, I have it not longer under control. We need regulation. So, and the second thing what we need to do is to create our own internet model. We don't have it in Europe for the moment. It is the American model, they take our data and make the profits with it, or it is the, and that I don't want, the Chinese model, where they are following everybody. So I think we need our own model. And the only way to do it, because there are no big European digital companies, is to have finally one European regulator, so that we don't need to have 28 authorizations before a young company can start something new on.
Ms. Tomic, what is your point of view on this issue, regulations and fines?
When I was young, we didn't have any computers and one prototype was big as a classroom. Now everybody has his own mobile phone, but even though your generation is the first generation after Second World War who lives worse than their parents. And here I come to my point that all corporations like Google, Amazon, and Facebook should pay taxes in the countries where they operate, like GAFA tax, because these funds will be needed to welfare state, to education, and also to transition to green technology. So we have to abolish all tax havens for all corporations and make a fair taxation for all.
Follow-up question to you. Now, there's been a lot of discussion on the new copyright directive that the EU has adopted. Now, you've been an artist yourself. What is your opinion on this new directive? Will it limit freedom of speech or will it protect performers and artists like yourself?
Well, European left strictly votes against this legislation, which was on the table now, but we are quite sure that everybody must have the free access of internet, and knowledge is knowledge for everyone, and we cannot protect from the richest people that others cannot get the right informations.
Seriously, this woman absolutely does not understand what she's asked.
Where do you stand on bigger fines and newer regulations?
Regulate very clearly. I mean, the digital agenda, the digital future is there and it's giving a lot of opportunities, but clearly it needs to be regulated. Otherwise, what you will have is data monopolists. And I think there, I don't agree with Mr. Zahradil that we are on the right track. For example, in competition policies, we cannot still look at the position of data, which is, of course, centered to a couple of companies. So they need to be regulated. We want to make sure that those companies are delivering services to the people, instead of what they're doing now is making profit over data.
Okay, you wouldn't know it by just listening to him, but this Green guy is actually a fairly smart individual. But here's the thing, ideology trumps IQ. For example, his demonization of profit is socialist propaganda. There was once a great speech by Yuri Maltsev, I think is his name. He is a professor who used to work as an economist for Mikhail Gorbachev on the Perestroika. And he made out very clearly how the Soviet Union operated. The interesting part is that motivation works on two levels. You can either, or mostly on two levels, and you can either whip or you can give sugar. And what socialists often try to do is to take away your ability to get sugar. So individuals just serving the community and getting gratification out of it, money and so on, profit is to be demonized, so that what is left for the authoritarians is the whipping until force and fear is the only thing that drives people, and people do not even think of something else that could motivate them to do certain stuff. So in the Soviet Union, the productivity was at best when the state was most brutal against its citizens. And this is what you hear again and again in the rhetoric. You will also see that later in a number of other instances. Profit must be demonized.
And that needs to change. Indeed, on data protection, by the way, Green Rapporteur, he delivered to make sure that at least our data is better protected. This was very much lobbied against by Facebook. But now they have to follow the European rules. They are now claiming that it should be global. And this shows you the power of European regulation. They don't want it, but once they have to comply, they know it's better to make it a global standard. And that's where Europe can be strong.
Now, the other areas where we know there's a problem is that a lot of these big companies do not pay their fair share of taxes. Occasionally, not at all. You have been very strong as the Greens on clamping down on tax evasion, but how are you actually going to do it? How are you going to convince national governments to make a collective effort, or how are you going to somehow change the EU's powers so that you can take
Well, this is about future EU powers, and this is where EU at the moment is lacking powers.
Yes, but how? Tell us how.
Yes, so how? This is exactly where a campaign is for, that people do realize that you need to strengthen Europe in order to give them the possibility to tax companies. What is happening now is that countries are just competing against each other to offer the lowest rate of taxation on companies. This needs to be European power in order to make sure that every company, and certainly tech companies, are paying their fair share of taxation. And how this means in every country, we need to make sure that they are convinced and the people are convinced that this is the only way to treat and to tackle the company.
Moving on.
Frans Timmermans, for you the same question.
You know, these things are really amazing. It gives me the opportunity to stay in touch with my family when I'm traveling and campaigning. I can share pictures on social media, and we have all these selfies, and we use them all the time. Amazing. At the same time, there's a downside. These tech companies use the data you give them for free, and they make billions of profits.
But the specific question has to do with what we call the lobbyist that normally calls the politician. Now, you and Facebook's chief lobbyist, Nick Clegg, from Mr. Verhofstadt, indeed, you are both long-time liberals. Will you call him in your first days as Commission President? And what changes from Facebook would you demand from him?
Well, to tackle Facebook is to have an own European Facebook, the fastest as possible, because I agree with all the measures that have been proposed by Frans and by Bas Eickhout, not by you, Mr. Zahradil, not by you, but with the others. So I agree with all these proposals.
Yes, he agrees with everything, with the exception of the stuff that the supposedly conservative speaker has said, namely that some level of sovereignty should be respected, but that is the only minor point where they differ. The entire event is called a debate, and this has bigger. This speaks of a bigger problem, and it is hardly ever said, but I have to address it. We Europeans, with the exception of Great Britain, we do not understand the word debate. We have no concept for it. Quite literally, that there is a pro and a con, and that you should hear both sides, and that you hear arguments, and that you make up your own mind from the different arguments and the information that you get and the ideas, the proposals that are put forth. This seems so natural to English speakers and to Jews that you think that all Europeans are like this, or at least you probably even think it's universal. You think in China they are having debates like Americans and so on. But the reality is that we don't have the intellectual capacity to do this. This sounds very rude, and I have to be that rude, but it is the truth. And it is also the reason why the Iraq War, for example, failed. Democracy is only possible where people even entertain the idea of exchanging views and giving pros and cons and making arguments and listening to different ideas and so on and so on. This very concept of exchanging arguments, real arguments in a polite manner, does not exist in most cultures. It exists in Judaism and it exists in the English-speaking world, but it does not exist in most cultures, and you see this happening on the stage. And you see that across the Arab world and in Africa and so on. And Europe, despite our prosperity and our technological advancements, we are culturally much behind the English-speaking world, as sad as it is. And I would love to change my mind on that, but it took me a while to understand that we have a very different mind and a very different culture, and that we are not yet as developed as Americans are. Sorry.
So the problem is there. If we create one standard in Europe, one regulator, we will create also our own Facebook, our own Google, our
Thank
own
you very
Amazon.
much, Mr.
And that's the way to go forward.
We now have to turn.
And now this communist left party person is asked how she can reconcile her wish of a full employment while she is attacking capitalism and the innovative tech companies. And it's just hilarious. They don't understand how innovation works, that there is some ingenuity involved, and here's what she says.
The jobs must come because the full employment must be taken into the concern. But we will create them like we propose the Green New Deal for Europe, like some prosperity forces in USA. So Green New Deal will create jobs and also the green technology.
The Green Party person is chiming in and says that the high-tech job market will be created by simply buying the industry. I mean, creating it by investment. And this is the kind of rhetoric that you will also hear from Angela Merkel and other communists. He is contradicted by the liberal who says, no, you cannot just simply invest taxpayer money into something and the corporations will flourish. The good way to go about this is to simply prohibit enough stuff, and innovation will follow from prohibition.
Because for the simple reason that, in my opinion, it is not the public authority who have to create these internet platforms. You are talking about public investment. Public investment is needed in roads. Public investment is needed in
not in digital infrastructure.
In public transport. But is this, in my opinion, not needed. It's not to the public authorities to start an internet business.
Of course, the socialist is not honest enough to say that he is siding with China. He suggests that the digital revolution will bring us 5G, which is the digital standard put forward by the Chinese tech company Huawei. Huawei is claiming to be a private business, but in reality they are actually state-owned. They don't admit it, but there is enough evidence to suggest that. And he believes that 5G will somehow bring the green innovation and solve all environmental problems.
If we introduce 5G in our cities, we can reduce carbon emissions radically because we change radically the way we organize mobility. Show that these investments lead to a more sustainable Europe. Show the rest of the world that if they follow our example, we can make it a carbon neutral EU by 2050.
We are basically ostracized at this point. That was it for today. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you soon. Bye.